In this video, we're going to discuss the advanced account profiling features of Zhube. Zhube is free software to detect, prevent and investigate money laundering, fraud and compliance breaches. So we'll pick up broadly where we left off in previous videos. I'm going to start by creating a new abstraction rule that targets declined transactions. Before I move to the abstraction rule screen, just note the response code has been processed as 1 hitherto. I'm going to infer anything that is not 1 as being a decline. I'll navigate to abstraction rules. Observing the existing abstraction rule, which is targeting all transactions that do not have a billing country in Cyprus, counting them up over a 1-day period. My new abstraction rule is going to be very similar, but instead I'm going to call it velocity rule declined. So it's going to have a different disposition based on the response code. Other than that, the profile of the rule is much the same. I'm going to look for a billing country that is not equal to CY. But this time, I'm going to add in a further criteria relating to the response code. So if the response code is not equal to 1, then this one is going to be considered matched. So it means to say that 1 is approved, everything else is declined. This is just for illustrative purposes, as we're going to move on to compare this abstraction rule value, keeping in mind that the previous abstraction rule that we created did not have response code filtering. I'm going to check response payload so we can echo it out, useful for debugging, and that abstraction rule is now added. I won't synchronize for the moment, as there are some further steps we would like to take to contrast the declined count, the declined velocity, with the overall count, the overall velocity. The comparison or profile is achieved through abstraction calculations, which are intended to compare one abstraction rule value with another. In this case, we're dividing the declined velocity by the overall velocity, keeping in mind that we're grouping this by the account ID. So I'll click on the upper left-hand side to create a new abstraction calculation, and I'm going to call this decline ratio. Now on the left-hand side of the function, I'm going to take the smaller of the two values, and on the right-hand side of the function, I'm going to take the larger. So by dividing the number of declined transactions by the overall number of transactions, which will include the declined, I arrive at a ratio. There's several rudimentary functions, add, subtract, divide, multiply, which takes this left-right component. Yet I can actually code using the intermediate language a function to perform that calculation. So ultimately the function can be anything that can be accomplished in the .NET runtime. But in this simple example, I'm going to settle with just division. Add that abstraction calculation and synchronize the model. Meanwhile, I'll move over to a pre-prepared JSON post, noting that I've changed the response code to 2 to indicate a decline. Post the transaction and let's inspect the response payload. Notice that I now have 2 abstraction rule values being written out. I have 28 transactions in total, of which 7 have been declined. The abstraction calculation I created has done the sums for me, meaning to say the decline ratio is at 25%. So right here, right now, this customer's, keeping in mind the search key is account ID, has 28 transactions in the last day, of which 7 have been declined. If we want to start putting that into context with what this account, what this customer usually does, we're able to use a tool called Abstraction deviations. Abstraction deviations exist for the purpose of comparing what is happening in this moment, so in this case we had 7 declined transactions, with what usually happens for this customer. So I'm going to create an abstraction deviation called decline profile. And what I'm interested in is comparing the current abstraction rule value with what has gone before for these abstractions. So I'm going to use a z-score for the purposes of expressing the extent to which this deviates from what we would expect of the customer. So I've added that. I'm going to synchronize the model. come back to my pre-prepared post and send in a post. Scrolling down into the response body, we can see the decline profile has a z-score of 1.8, meaning to say it's 1.8 standard deviations above the average. That is very unusual. It's much more than you would expect to see for this customer. These abstraction deviations can be at an account level, they can be at a merchant level, they can be at an IP service provider level. Naturally, abstractions, abstraction deviations, and abstraction calculations can be used for the purposes of activation rules, but they can also be used for the purposes of machine learning, as we will observe in subsequent videos. Joub is free software to detect, prevent, and investigate money laundering, fraud, and compliance breaches. It's available at Amazon Web Services Marketplace.